Cool. Okay, we're just gonna start on time-ish. Well, thank you everyone. I know it's a small audience, but it's great. I'm Tania Allard. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm gonna be talking about a topic that I am very, very passionate about. I've been working in open source, using open source for many years, and I love it so much that I've somehow managed to build a career and just like work full time on it. So for those of you that don't know me, I wear lots of hats, most of which are again related to open source communities, open source sustainability. And right now I'm working as a co-director of Quantsite Labs. Many of you will probably have not heard about Quantsite Labs, but we are what we call ourselves an open source innovation lab. And our core principle is finding ways to build sustainable open source projects and open source communities. There are many ways in which we do this. One of these is connecting the folks that are working in the open source ecosystem with the end users and different industries, with other organizations, and in general, rethinking how we can fund and make open source sustainable for the long term. And since we care a lot about open source sustainability, but as a holistic approach, we are not only a group of developers or folks that are maintaining teams, but we cover areas that are massively underserved in our ecosystem, like documentation, like technical documentation, usability and accessibility design, policymaking, and many, many others. So just to set expectations, this is what we're going to be covering, or what I'm going to be covering in this talk. Just a very brief history lesson on how open source came to be. I always like to start this kind of talks with that refresher because I make a lot of assumptions on what you all know about open source and free software. Then where we are up now, there are so many things to talk about, and then move on to how we can actually start thinking about the sustainability of open source and how we as individuals and organizations interact with open source projects and ecosystems. I remember like many, many years ago, I can't remember exactly where I read a quote or something that said that you know that a piece of tech or something has made it because you don't even have to think about it. It has gone from being a commodity to being a part of your everyday life. And this is the state where we are currently in open source. We don't have to think about it because it's everywhere. Doesn't matter if you're trying to check your bank account, if you're driving your car, if you're reading the news, if you are networking with other folks. There are many layers and many ways in which we are unconsciously and unintentionally interacting with open source on a daily basis, as well as public infrastructure. So how is this happen? Like, how did it go from a fringe, rare movement into a mainstream, like whole ecosystem that is everywhere that we just like interact with on a daily basis? For those of us that are young enough to remember, we will have that notion and that idea that free and open was not always the norm. It has taken up a lot of strength and a lot of momentum over the last few decades, but certainly it was not always how companies and individuals approached software development. One of the biggest precedents or landmarks in the software industry was when proprietary operating systems like MS-DOS were released around 1981. And this was actually a very, very big landmark or milestone for the creation of proprietary licenses. As a company that was very small at the time, now like Microsoft, probably some of you have heard about it, was the company in charge of this operating system, all of the licensing, and basically started the whole movement of proprietary software, by which you have to pay some sort of royalty or licensing fee for you to be able to use and access the software. However, these proprietary licenses, as many of you know, come with a lot of strings attached, meaning that you cannot make copies legally. You cannot distribute versions or copies of the software legally, and you cannot modify it, again, legally. And the emergence of this proprietary software or proprietary licenses approach also spun up a lot of conversations about the nature of software and their access rights and, in general, the freedom. So a lot of folks from MIT, from the computer lab, you'll probably have heard about Richard Stallman spearheading like this political and activist movement, started taking access and use of software as a natural human or individual right. All of these movements and starting gathering like-minded individuals is what led to the origin of the GNU. And in broader terms, the emergence of the free software movement, which again led to the creation of the Free Software Foundation. And this foundation is very, very essential for what is to come. And like this whole activism movement is very essential for where we are now. There is another big milestone, and this actually has to do also with public software. And at a certain point, Netscape released the source code of the browser. So all of the code that they used to build this browser was made out in the public. Folks could access it, folks could study, folks could start modifying and building on top of it. This again led to another movement and another paradigm on the access and use of software. So this eventually, thanks to some folks from Silicon Valley, like many things happen in our ecosystem, led to the formation of the open source and open source as a term and open source initiative. But again, I've used so many times the word now free software, or open source. But I also talk a lot about these topics. And I find that many folks do have like a good understanding of the differences between free and open source software, and some others not so much. Seems like a lot of these definitions and like what makes public software public and open source software open source has just gone through this telephone game. Like, we kind of know, but we don't really know. So again, the whole movement and the whole idea of free software builds on these four freedoms. That is, first, you should be able to run the software for any purpose. It can be for usage, well, for you as individual use, for your organization, for research or exploratory purposes, which ties to, if you have access to the code, you should also be able to study how this program or how this software actually works. If you want to help your neighbor, or if you want to share this goodness of free software, you can then share it. You can distribute it. You can make copies. You can make forks. You can share it widely without any violation of legalese or legal implications. And probably one of the most important aspects is you're able to improve how the software works. Not only for your own purpose, but again, build on what is out there, make forks, redistribute, share, and generally build towards the whole community benefit. Now, we've seen, and this is probably one of my pet peeves, whenever I hear a lot of folks talking about free software and open source software, to say, well, let's use open source because it's free. But the reason why this happens is because we're conflating, especially in English, it's very easy to conflate these two usages or these two uses of the word free. One being free as in, I invite you, let's have a pint, it's on me. So there is no tag price included. The other one is free as a bird, and which is where the free software movement aligns, in the sense of it should be easily accessible by folks with no strings attached. I think these nuances are much better explained in other languages, like Spanish. So the Spanish-speaking community probably doesn't have like this conflation of terms. Whenever we talk about free software, again, we talk about as free as a bird, like freedom. And then this is the open source definition. This is what I've found by talking to loads of developers and organizations that is not as clear as those for freedoms. We have now platforms like GitHub, GitLab. And again, the emergence of these platforms that are now like social media / portfolio / sharing knowledge or archival systems have loads of code. So a lot of folks think that because their code is out there on GitHub or whatever you're building, by default, it is open source and free or open source. But that's not true. For any piece of software to be able to be labeled and used as open source, it has to meet these 10 tenets. If any of this is not met for any reason, you cannot call it open source. And this is what I'm going to say, the single source of truth. The open source initiative maintains these tenets, these principles, and this is what we all folks that work in open source or interact with open source refer to whenever we say those words. As you can see, the extension of this definition spans way more than, well, you can access a code, study, run it, distribute it, and modify it. It goes into more pragmatic approaches and tenets like, well, you should be able to somehow guarantee or make explicit disclose on the integrity of the author's source code. Also, you cannot discriminate on who's using your software in terms of individuals, organizations, purposes, fields of endeavor, and this has caused also a lot of tension. Because when a lot of folks started building open source software and releasing it in the wild, we never anticipated what the impact of that software was going to have. It's great that now we're building businesses and for nonprofits and helping marginalized communities, but also it's more and more being used in surveillance systems or in defense. And many folks disagree with those values, but under the open source definition, because we can't discriminate against those fields of endeavor, we are at an impasse. We can't not restrict what our software is used for. And this is very important because there are a lot of movements now in the open source community to start building more ethical licensing and more ethical and trust-based licensing approaches for open source. Again, and then if we look at the definition of community, anywhere where you go, it's going to tell you that it is a group of people that have shared values and missions. And this is what the 4 freedoms and this open source definition gives you. It gives you tenets by which you, as a user, maintainer, developer, or advocate of open source or free software, adhere to. But again, even though these 2 branches come from a the same origin, that is again, the creation of proprietary software, and then a movement advocating for us to have free access or unrestricted access to the software, it diverted into 2 branches. One being a development methodology, like many of us probably use at work, agile and waterfall and all of the such, whereas free software has remained and will always remain more a social movement, more of an activism initiative. So again, why is this important? This is all of this historic landmarks and these definitions matter because that's how we align as communities, and those are the shared values that we have. That is what we trust, what we believe in, and how we are building all of these ecosystems. I don't know how many of you have been around since the 80s in the tech industry, but back then, most companies, if you wanted to have your software products, then that meant that it was proprietary. So you needed a whole team of folks, one developing, maintaining it, doing everything from scratch. And many times, if you were to change jobs, well, you would go into the same working patterns. The emergence of free and open source software has changed that entirely. It has made it so much easier and so much cheaper at acquisition and buy time to build software. We no longer have to rely on open source software, which is, well, in proprietary software, which is a big problem because we don't have that price tag attached. But also, because of this, is also what has fueled this massive startup boom. It is so much easier to start experimenting. There are new business models, for example, like Hugging Face in the machine learning space, where they have built a business around open source and enabling folks to build on top of open source tools. For us, as folks that work in tech, it has certainly shifted the power dynamics when it comes to recruiting, retention, and moving across companies or projects. Because if you master a few open source programming languages or frameworks, it makes it also so much easier for you to take your expertise, your best practices, and your knowledge to many different companies across the globe. So again, this has also changed how many companies go about finding developers and interacting with software as a whole. Also, in theory, and like I know a lot of folks are going to say, yeah, that's not true. Now, supply chain security is in everyone's agenda. But the truth is, in theory, free and open source software has the potential to be very, very secure. The reason being because you have way many hands, like a lot of eyes, a lot of folks working on it day in, day out, and you should be able to spot vulnerabilities and disruptions easier. I am aware that we've had like big problems, like big attacks, big issues, like recently Log4j, Heartbleed, and so many. But that is part of another bigger problem. And I mentioned before that another big landmark was the fact that GitHub, GitLab, and other similar platforms have emerged. Using data here from the GitHub Octoverse from 2021, I follow this every year. They do their developer survey. They get numbers, of course. Disclosure that has a huge bias because it's platform dependency. We have a lot of developers that are not on GitHub. But if you look at the historical trends, the number of folks, the number of projects, the number of interactions on GitHub has been growing like crazy over the last few years. And even in regions that we wouldn't historically think of as participants in open source, like Africa or South America, we've seen a massive uptake in folks participating in public software. The problem came with, again, a lot of that conflation of free at development point and free at acquisition point. Business, including startups, big established corporations, unicorns, series, whatever it is, started migrating and turning their heads around to open source. But there were still a lot of awareness gaps. We have built on, I don't know if you've ever read The Cathedral and Bazaar, which is also an amazing read for open source software development, but it describes very well the different mechanisms by which people self-organize to develop and maintain open source projects. In theory, everything sounds very nice. You can bring in many contributors, then you don't have to worry about your project because someone will take over it. And you have basically hundreds of people queuing up for them to maintain your project. That is, again, a very nice thought, a very nice principle, but that doesn't happen in reality. So again, the Ford Foundation commissioned or worked on this report with Nadia Gabal, which is, again, one of my favorite reads when it comes to open source sustainability. And this report was very thorough and highlighted very, very big problems on open source and open infrastructure. Not very unexpected quote or statement is that sustaining critical open and public infrastructure is hard, because much of the usage and much of, again, the benefits that folks see in using open source is attached to that free at acquisition point label. But again, as we are building, as we are growing the use, the adoption, and the hype around open source, we are increasingly adding more demand on those who maintain all of this digital infrastructure. Recently, a very good friend of mine that does a lot of research on maintainership and contributor experience realized that for NMP, I think most of the projects that are there have 2 maintainers. In my ecosystem where I work with, that is more in scientific Python and machine learning, some of the most critical projects that are the basis of every single Python-based open source project that people are using for machine learning, deep learning, AI, have 1 or 2 maintainers. So if one of these folks were to leave, whatever reason, we're going to be in a very big one. So, of course, when Nadia and the Ford Foundation released this report and highlighted the many flaws, like the many risks and the many lack of strategy around open source, we, as technologists and other funders, decided to do what we do best, and that is build tools, like build platforms, build something. And we have started seeing since around that time, 2016, an emergence of many platforms where you can go and get funding or money to the folks that are building your favorite open source projects. Examples of this are GitHub sponsors. I don't know if you've seen or you sponsor a maintainer on GitHub. I do sponsor some. LiberaPay, Mozilla started some open source grants, the Linux Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg, and many. And again, this comes to a lot of our social constructs where we have grown and developed in an economy and in a world where we tend to equate sustainability with funding. We think that if something has enough money, if something is creating enough monetary value or return on investment, or we throw money at something, then almost by magic, it's going to be sustainable. And these are 2 things that are not the same. We have many problems. Like, I think funding is a very big problem because a lot of the folks that are building and working on open source in many capacities are doing that out of love and out of passion and out of their voluntary time. But we have many problems like volunteer burnout, community mismanagement, lack of governance, and also it's easy to get funding for some innovative or like some very hot topics and projects, but it's so much harder to get long-term funding for all of those essential projects that are underpinning all of the public infrastructure, just because they are not sexy, but they are needed. And also, one of my, as part of the role that I do for my communities and for my company, one of my one of the main advantages is that I go to conferences, I go to Maintainer Summit, I interact with different organizations and maintainers. I get to talk to a lot of people. And many of them have very mixed feelings when it comes to all of these platforms by where you can fund them and sponsor them. Some of them, when you ask them, what would you need, to make your life easier as a maintainer, or your project sustainability better, money is not always the number one. Sometimes it is time, which is funny because in many cases, time equates money. Um, but sometimes they get this money, but they don't have plans on how to spend it. Like suddenly they are given this grants or they're given like this one-off donations, but they don't have plans on what to do with that money, how they're going to get more money after that nice pot of funding is over. So again, we're trying to solve a much deeper problem that encompasses a lot of very complex social interactions with short-term funding. One of probably my favorite analogy on how we're trying to solve this is we're trying to patch a pothole with duct tape. It is probably a temporary fix that will not make you think about it, but the pothole is there. And all of us, like, eventually it can be an hour, it can be a day, it can be a week. The duct tape is going to come off, and that pothole is still going to be there. We're not fixing those structural issues by throwing funding and money at these projects, just money. So how can we start thinking about reimagining this, what sustainability means, and the role that we play in open source sustainability? Well, this is something that I and my colleagues and a lot of my friends spend a lot of time thinking about. And to tackle all of those many societal, technological, and interpersonal and structural issues, it's always helpful to think about it as the same way that anyone would think about a corporate sustainability approach. You need to think about contributing back to the project. And I'm going to go back into it. It's not just about sending PRs or code fixes or bug fixes. We also have to think about diversity. And I'm not just talking about diversity of folks, but human and environmental diversity. Again, go back to the open source definition, tenets, think about geographical distribution, tool diversity. I know a lot of folks are very reticent to make their tools compatible, for example, with Windows. I'm like, well, probably that's a problem that Microsoft should be solving in their own words. But again, if you are refusing to support those platforms that folks are using, sometimes because they don't have any other option, you are like limiting the number of folks that can be engaging with your project. We also have to think about diversity of people, diversity of funding, have an exit strategy, and also, very, very important, think about community safety at all levels. Now, these three boxes, or these three parts of open source sustainability, are linked together. It's not that we can just focus on one and then leave the other two, or come back to that later. We have to work on these three at the same time, iteratively. And it takes a lot of time. Now, again, there are many initiatives in trying to get first-time contributors or new contributors to a project. But when we're thinking about contributing back, we have to be very honest. And as an individual, there are mostly three things that we can give back. One, your time. Some folks, like the organizers of these conferences and other conferences, user groups, they go around building spaces for open source users and developers to come together. That is very important. Spending time responding to questions on Stack Overflow, that also helps. If you have unique talents also that you can bring, that goes again to your technical skills. If you're a PM, if you're a designer, if you're an accessibility expert, if you have spent your time doing corporate sustainability plans, that is something that we need a lot of in open source. And then again, a lot of other folks, what they have, what they can contribute with, because of time limitations, other commitments, is their treasure, is money. And that's fine. And I think the most important thing is being honest with what we have, what our constraints are, and finding ways to maximize what we have so that it can actually benefit the open source ecosystem. And this is a very, very open question. Like, I'm gonna just a super quick show of hands. How many of you use open source for your for your day work in any capacity? Or for fun, hobbies, whatever. Okay, so most of you, do you know the real cost of open source sustainability? How would you go about calculating the cost? What factors would you even consider? Money, developer time, what else? Resources, that can be anything like tools, right? Like CI, infrastructure, security audits, design, accessibility. It is a lot. There are a lot of both direct and indirect costs. If we go back to the mechanisms by which many organizations are supporting open source, let's think back to Travis CI. For a very long time, they were providing their continuous integration platform free of charge for open source projects. That was great because a lot of open source projects were using their infrastructure, were using their continuous integration. What happened not so long ago, they decided to scrape that. And what happened there is folks had to scramble up all of a sudden with no notice or very little notice to find an alternative, because the alternative was not having continuous integration or continuous delivery. So the direct cost there as well, they lost the platform, but all of the indirect cost was researching alternatives, one, that were cost efficient. A lot of folks migrated to GitHub Actions because they also have a free tier, but then it was like developer time. It's not like if you have your configuration for one provider, it's straightforward all the time to migrate to another provider. So that was, again, a lot of development time, a lot of research, and all the stress. And that happens not just once in your life as a maintainer. That happens time and time again. So we have a lot of indirect costs that are very, very hard to put in numbers and are very hard for you to go to your executive and say, hey, this is our real cost of open source. So how do you measure? How do you go and convince your company that it is worth doing something for open source when it's just so hard to quantify the real cost of developing, maintenance, and sustainability? Again, I don't know how familiar you are all with emerging markets. A lot of folks compare the world of open source with an emerging market because, again, it has gone from something that is rare and it's now part of our everyday lives, but also they're highly volatile. You put a lot of skin in the game, but you can leave out empty-handed. And in cases like that, especially if you go without a strategy, yes, they're very risky. If you just go heads down without prior planning, it's hard. You can get burned very easily. We have seen a lot of corporate examples and individual examples where they've entered, something horrible happened, and they left like absolutely burned. So how many of you as individuals or organization, team leader, corporation have a free and open source exit strategy? Let's say something horrible happens, open source disappears. Do you have an exit strategy? Yes? No. I do. For me, and this is as an individual, as an organization, it is much harder. But I also have another very personal and individual exit strategy. I maintain a lot of projects. I maintain communities. So for me, as a community organizer, maintainer, developer, my exit strategy is planning for sustainability. And how do I know that I've done it? Because I should be able to remove myself from all of these projects and all of these communities, and they will still thrive. Like, there should be no disruption of me, of those projects or communities if I were to be hit by a bus tomorrow. And we need to plan as an individual, as an organization, and as a corporate level. At that, having those milestones, having those exit strategies and clear indicators that you're actually building for sustainability. Another very reflective question: how many times have you seen a corporate release or a corporate backed open source tool, framework, platform fail? When was the last time that we were at, oh, I was going to name something, but Flu, Reimagine V2, whatever annual event, they released this amazing platform that is going to obliterate Kubernetes and everything you can think of. It's open source. It's all people can talk about for a month on Twitter and LinkedIn, has 500,000 stars on GitHub, and a year later, nobody talks about it. There are no more stores, nobody's answering to issues, PRs are not getting sent or merged. Again, this is an indicator of failed strategies. I truly believe that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations have the best intentions. But again, if you go in without one, lack of a strategy, without that lack of understanding of the cost of open source sustainability and open source as a whole, it's very easy to end in this vicious cycle that you'll throw something out, either for the community or for the maintainers. You're not going to be able to quantify the impact of whatever it is that you throw out. And then your executive is going to be like, okay, that was nice. It was a nice intention. Let's move on. So how can you, as an individual, as a decision maker, as an organization, build strategies that will not fail? First, build and trust. Open source, free and open source software are two ecosystems where everything is built on trust. Most folks build stuff with people that they might not even meet in person ever. So you are trusting a random person with a unicorn avatar in GitHub that is giving you a present of their code or a security audit and an accessibility audit. So a lot of that is built on trust. And building trust takes time. It's very hard. And it can take many ways. But the first step is showing up and listening. Again, you cannot just build a whole strategy on trust. Trust is a first starting point or a first stepping stone. I've seen a lot of corporations looking at those big companies, mostly FAANG, again, Facebook, well, then it's Facebook, what is it? Apple, Netflix, Google, whatever it is. And all of these big corps or these big FAANGs are adopting the principle or the approach of developing open source program offices. If you go to any of these ones, you're going to see Google has one, Meta has one, Microsoft has one, Adobe has one. Any big corporation has jumped onto the open source program office. And in principle, it's great because they're acknowledging the importance and the impact of open source. Once again, think about the resources that these corporations have in comparison to most open source projects that are community-driven, community-led, community-organized. Unless you are someone like Microsoft or Adobe that has that untapped bunch of resources and you know you're going to have that for a while, then more than likely is that you don't need an OSPO. You don't need an open source program office. It's very hard, especially when your executives are asking for hard numbers to say, okay, why do you even want to start an OSPO? Why do you want to start doing this? The hardest part is advocating again for open source, for the impact of open source. Okay, and you don't always need an OSPO. Okay, there are some instances in which Fang has owned it, it's successful. I have a lot of friends that work in all of these OSPOs, but for the smaller companies and individuals like us, that doesn't work. So again, how do we go about it? First, determine what projects are critical or strategically important for your team or what you're building. This is easy to do. Look at all of the open source projects, your infrastructure, your platforms. What are those projects that if they were to disappear for any reason, blow up, whatever, you cannot use them, how many of those will prevent you from doing what you're doing or prevent you from providing service to your users or customers? 2, evaluate the longevity needs of the project and current gaps. And this takes a lot of time and research. Sometimes it takes the form of going to the GitHub repo, see when was the last time that a pull request was merged, seeing one of the pull requests that have been opened the longest, why? Is it because nobody's reviewing them? Is it because there is a lot of bug shedding, or because the contributor just disappeared and there is no one else to take that on? Look at how they're building communities, how they're treating newcomers. Do they have community safety? Do they have open channels for you as a user, contributor, new contributor, aspiring contributor to engage with the project? Do they have many projects now have started adopting this list of fundable projects, and they say, well, we are moving away from one-time donations because that is not sustainable. But we have this number of these XYZ projects that we would like to get done, or these features. One, which doesn't have the resources in terms of time, people, talent, money. So if you want to make a meaningful contribution to the project, these are ways. See if your project has something like that. When was the last time that they accessed funding? When was the last time that they made a release? And by starting looking at all of these metrics, at all of these community and maintainer interactions, you can start getting a very comprehensive view of where the project and its community is heading and start identifying gaps. Sometimes it's not as, you cannot get the whole picture. Most times you cannot get a whole picture. So you have to take an active step forward and start contributing, however that is, showing up to community calls, sending pull requests, triaging issues, doing whatever, but also listening to people, engage meaningfully with the people that have been around for a while. Ask them, what skills are you missing? When was the last time that you engaged with a corporate partner? How did it go? Like, is that still a real relationship that you're maintaining? And if not, why did it fail? Get an understanding, talk to them, not just jump, throw the money, or send them 500 pull requests. Please don't do that. Or don't just go, like, I've seen this. I've seen corporate, again, folks that are very well intended. They go, open a public repo, do an accessibility audit, file 200 issues of things saying, like, this doesn't meet criteria, this doesn't that, like this, that, provide no solutions, no road mapping, no path forward. So what are they creating? They're just creating additional burden and load for the maintainers. And to be honest, it's also diminishing the trust from the community in the project. Again, communicate that. If you're planning to do something, a lot of folks would be very grateful if you were to do a security audit for them, or an accessibility audit for them, or a well-thought roadmap, but talk to them first, not hit them with 200 open issues, because that's not going to go well. So once again, think about, it's not just what you can bring, but what you can meaningfully bring. How are you going to align your interests, your talents, your treasure with what the project and the folks leading the project need. And that's how you build a strategy that is not going to fail, because you're not throwing stuff without impact from your corporation into a project, and then you're not throwing just things to a project that doesn't even know what to do with it. So as a company, if you have decision making or have your own startup or are your own boss, as a company, there are many things that we can bring. These are just some examples, and these are some of the things that we do. For example, at Quantum Labs, we provide administrative support for those folks, for example, that have Open Collective or other platforms, and they don't even know, like, they have to file taxes. They have to go through the local taxing system to be able to get money to volunteers. Provide also fiscal sponsorship, because fiscal sponsorship is also very critical for your projects. One of the folks that work at my organization, well, is a maintainer of SymPy. I don't know if you're familiar with that project, but it's a symbolic Python project that has been around for a while. We recently had an incident from one of these companies online that create this training courses and testing preparation for FANG-like interviews. And they filed a complaint saying that the SymPy folks were stealing content from their platform. They sent that request to GitHub on a Friday evening, UK time, saying that it was just before a bank holiday as well, that they had 2 business days to sort that issue, or they were going to shut down the GitHub repository. Of course, that happened. It was taken down. So I know that GitHub does that with the best intention. But then digging deeper into that problem, we realized that this corporation that was filing the complaint has done it not 1 time, but like 100 times. In this case, the SymPy project was lucky enough to have a fiscal sponsorship that also provide legal functions. So they were able to go back, protect themselves, and get all of their content reinstated. But again, that cost a lot of overheads for our organization, the maintainers of the project, the legal folks, the fiscal sponsorship. That's a lot of work. What happens when they slap smaller projects that don't have all of this additional support and fiscal sponsorship, legal advice? Those projects are just completely shut down because of a bad actor. So if you have these unique resources, these unique skills, you can start building corporate programs that will fill those gaps, that will improve not only your relationship with the project, but with other external stakeholders. Again, focus not only on coding functions, focus on all of those skills that we have plenty of in corporate world, but are missing in open source. PMing, again, is something that doesn't exist. As an individual, again, you can bring your talent, whatever that is, your skills, your expertise. Some folks come from very unusual, untraditional backgrounds and have legal expertise, so they help with that. If you have time, organize groups, organize community calls, attend community calls. If you care about a project and they're running user experience experiments or surveys, take some time and help them get the data they need. And again, if you have money and that's all you can give, by all means, do it. So at Quantum Labs, we have started, as I said, we've started rethinking all of the sustainability mechanisms and funding mechanisms. And one of the things that has been the most successful with our partners and clients, because we also do consultancy, is this concept of collaborative work order. So we bring in these 3 things that folks can contribute to. That is time. Time comes from us as labs that provide also all of that administrative and non-coding functions. We have our clients or sponsors that are meaningfully engaging with the project, and also the maintainers that work at our company. Sometimes the clients say, hey, I use this project. I have $50,000. I want to give them up. I want to sponsor them. How can I go? So we build strategies to take that treasure that they have, build common grounds so that they can engage meaningfully. And we already have a lot of maintainers because we hire the maintainers to work full-time on open source. But again, having that corporate and collaborative work order brings in interested parties that also only have the money or sometimes don't have the capacity to build an OSPO of their own, but have the interest of building long-lasting relationships with projects. So we bring all of the stakeholders together and we create alignment on how we can meaningfully participate in open source. And again, this has been a result of building on hours and hours and hours and years of research, talking to maintainers, being a maintainer, being a community organizer. And this is I would say, a more straightforward alternative for you or corporations or small companies that don't have the capacity to build an OSPO, but do have alignment on how important open source is for their sustainability. So hopefully by now, a few of you will have thought about how you're engaging with open source or with free software and are thinking about how you can start building either your individual or corporate strategy for sustainability, engagement, and even exit strategies. Remember, when you're entering any of these kind of partnerships, it's like any other relationship in your life. It's going to take time. It's not easy. There are no shortcuts. There is no way to build trust fast. It takes time. It takes commitment. Don't try and find shortcuts. Please stop. Don't try again and patch potholes with duct tape. If you still need more convincing, as a company, not only it helps to have a more reliable supply chain, more reliable infrastructure, but it also helps a lot with employee retention and better communication. Especially in this world that we live now, where most folks are working some sort of remote or hybrid, what we've noticed is a lot of companies, or a lot of individuals, are not great at async communication. In open source, you have no other option than doing async communication. And surprisingly, the folks that were already doing open source for years are the best at those. As an individual, again, it helps you to build, that bargaining chip, build your skills, build reputation, create new opportunities for you and others, especially if you have a lot of privilege, but you can start mentoring others in the community that has less privilege than you, that comes from a different background, that comes from a marginalized community. You have a lot of potential to create new opportunities for all of these folks. You support emerging markets and emerging economies. We're seeing uptake, as I said, in places like Africa, South America, and we as participants of open source can help all of those economies, again, to better participate in the tech industry. So it also leads to tech equity, democratization, diversification of our own industry. So again, and I would like to say this 500 times, be aware of your constraints. Be aware of what you can give as an individual, as an organization, as a nonprofit. Identify your non-negotiables in terms of projects you must support and find ways to maximize your impact. Otherwise, it's just going to keep on being super hard for us to maintain open source and justify corporate involvement. And if you engage meaningfully, if you take a slow approach, take your time to build trust, I'm going to say it's easy because a lot of the conversations go through, okay, I'm putting 100,000 pounds in this project. What am I getting in return? And the only thing you can say is like, well, we're getting that one issue fixed, but we can rely on this project for 5 years. That's not an easy conversation, but it is worth it. It is so much worth it for you as an individual, for the corporation, and for the ecosystem. Thank you very much. And if you want to talk about anything open source, sustainability funding, I'm going to be hanging around today and tomorrow. That is my Twitter handle. It's probably the easiest way to find me around, or just drop me a message, contact, or anything.